Hey, good morning. In some cases, maybe good afternoon to everyone joining today. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to do a quick intro and then I'll hand it off to Kevin. But just to give you some context for what we're going to talk about today, and how we think about helping our customers, I just thought it'd be helpful. So, kind of where this comes from is that we see most companies today have obviously significant investments in Microsoft, and that most customers are looking for ways to maximize their investments and leverage Azure for all the benefits of cloud. And some customers need help understanding what they have in their agreements and what use cases they can identify to start taking advantage of Azure. And in other cases, customers just don't have the time to research and understand all the services available. So, regardless of where you're at, what we're going to talk about today specifically is using Azure to deliver or enhance business continuity and disaster recovery for your business. And it's a great use case, whether you need to protect workloads on-prem or in the cloud or even SaaS applications. So I'm excited for Kevin to go ahead and take over, and I'll hand it over to Kevin, and he'll be presenting on how to future-proof IT against failures leveraging Microsoft Azure. Kevin?
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ryan, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining our session called Future Proof Your IT Environment Against Failure. So, folks, we've got a lot of content to get through this morning or this evening if you're over this side of the world. If there are any questions, please submit them on the Q&A and or the chat. And Daria, Hannah, and Ryan, if there's any technical issues, please come off mic. I'll be focusing on the content. I might just miss something if you're trying to call me out on it. Okay, let's kick off. So today's agenda, I'm going to break this presentation up into 4 different sections. So the first section, I'm going to talk about just a brief introduction on what business continuity and disaster recovery is, or otherwise known as BCDR. In the second section, we'll talk about some BCDR scenarios and methodologies. The third section, we'll talk about ransomware and cyber recovery considerations, huge topic in IT at the moment. And then in the final section, we'll talk about how to strengthen your security posture with Azure. So if anyone is using Microsoft Azure, you should hopefully get some nice tips and tricks or even validation as to what you're currently doing. If you're not a Microsoft Azure house or a Microsoft house, the majority of the content in this presentation would be applicable to either an AWS or a Google or most of the enterprise-ready public cloud products and platforms.
And real quick, Kevin, before you continue, I should have mentioned it previously. I just wanted to say, so for those attending, if you have questions during the presentation, our attendees are muted, but you can use the Q&A in the presentation to submit questions, and so we can go ahead and we can make this interactive and dynamic. If you guys have questions, we're happy to dig into that more. And also, we may be polling you with some questions along the way based on some of those questions and interest, and would just ask that you respond to those polls so we can get a sense of where you're at with some things. So
Super.
just wanted to mention that.
Thanks a million, Ryan. Cheers. All right, folks. So an introduction to business continuity and disaster recovery. So BCDR is basically a collection of processes and tools that protect, restore, and keep your operations running during unpredictable events. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because most organizations, when I speak to them as a consultant, when I ask them, how comfortable are you with your BCDR posture? How happy are you that you have ticked all the boxes for your environment in terms of some sort of outage? Most organizations I ask that question to will say that they're pretty comfortable, but when we start digging into the weeds of it, they quickly find that maybe they've got some areas of BCDR really strong and other areas maybe not fully thought through. And why we find it matters is that you have to always assume that downtime in your IT estate is inevitable. We can't be too cocky to think that we're never going to have any kind of outage, whether it's vendor specific outages, whether it's internal IT staff or IT admin outages. any kind of issue can cause an outage or downtime. So you need to be sure that when you think about your BCDR scenarios, that you have planned for it, as you basically just not taking it for granted. You're going to have some sort of downtime at some point, hopefully really small, but some sort of downtime. Obviously, when you have downtime, depending on the nature of your business or the duration of that downtime, it can cause tangible impact to your business. So you could be down for an hour, or you could be down for weeks or days. Hopefully, none of those, but it can be very costly to your business, and you certainly need to be able to consider that. And then having a true and proper BCDR process and plan will help you mitigate against those losses. So very, very important in terms of planning your BCDR. So why do customers generally need to protect their IT estate? So it might sound pretty obvious, but there may be some scenarios that folks might not have thought about. So data corruption and deletion, that's really important. So you might have some sort of corruption incident. It might be completely innocuous. It might be just you've had some corrupt hard disks or hard drives if you're running your workloads on hardware, which most organizations are. They have kind of hybrid scenarios. It could be maybe somebody malicious inside your organization. Maybe it's an ex-employee or a soon-to-be ex-employee, or maybe it just could be somebody pulling the wrong trigger on some sort of IT management software like System Center Config Manager or something, and it could potentially delete or corrupt your data. So you certainly need to consider BCDR as an area for data corruption and deletion. Outages and natural disasters. So this could be anything from tornadoes to floods to fires, anything that could cause your data center and your IT estate and your IT workloads to fall over due to something that would be typically outside of your organization's control. That needs to be considered for your BCDR. Compliance. So we've had a lot of customers in the last few years come to us and say, hey, Ergo, can you please help us formulate a BCDR plan? And a lot of times, customers might not have even had that as a high item on their agenda, but maybe they're being audited. Maybe they've entered into a new business contract with an organization that requires them to have a certain level of BCDR compliance. So ensuring you have that right and ready is very important. And then ransomware, probably the most high profile reasons for customers requesting BCDR these days. Ransomware, where you can see all kinds of organizations around the world, big and small, could or will possibly get hit with ransomware at some point in time. So being ready for that is really important. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the different areas that people may or may not think they makes up a full BCDR scenario. So you have high availability. So if you think that high availability is your BCDR plan, that's not really true. So high availability is basically where you take your application or your workloads and you replicate or you distribute it across multiple redundant physical or virtual infrastructures. So maybe you have things like your traditional clusters, very common and very widespread with things like maybe VMware, Hyper-V. You might have database clusters, that's high availability where you have an active and a passive workload, or node rather. So if the active node goes down, the passive node kicks in automatically to give you and your end users that high availability. And it will obviously help prevent much, if any, impact to uptime. So on the surface of it, high availability may well be or may well come across as a true and proper BCDR scenario, but there are so many different areas of outages and downtime that can be affected by high availability, and basically you could easily lose your active and your passive node and you don't have anything to work from. High availability is also synchronous by nature, as opposed to disaster recovery, which is asynchronous by nature. And the difference between high availability and disaster recovery is with DR, or disaster recovery, you have your combination of tools and backups, and basically you have your workloads. Maybe you have some workloads on-prem and you replicate those workloads to public cloud, or maybe to, if it's a corporate data center in a different region or a different area, maybe connected to a different power grid and a different internet connection. But that is your active and passive sites as opposed to active and passive workloads. So they will take into account various outages and various downtime scenarios, such as natural disasters. If your primary data center gets hit, or it's flooded, or it's on fire, your secondary site, whether it be in the cloud or in a different data center region, will be sufficient. And in business continuity, kind of similar to disaster recovery, but more or less the priority for business continuity is basically exactly what it says. It's nature of it is to ensure that your business can continue. So at a bare minimum, your business continuity should be, in the event of a disaster, you have a copy of, well, a very up-to-date copy of your data somewhere. You might not have access to onboard and to use it very quickly, but your business will be able to continue because you have at least a backup copy of that data. So there are three different areas: high availability, disaster recovery, and business continuity. And the takeaway from this slide is, please don't think or consider that high availability ticks all the boxes for a BCDR scenario. So some of the methodologies and the scenarios for BCDR. So the first thing to do, and if you're doing this already, brilliant. If you're not doing this already, and this is one of the questions people often ask when they say, hey, Kev, we want to validate our BCDR. We've got, our workloads replicated up into the cloud, and we've got, high availability here, and we've got backups there. Are we good to go? And the first question I normally ask our customers is, have you documented and defined your business continuity plan, or your BCP? And a solid BCP should include the following at a minimum. And by the way, most customers will tell me, no, we have not documented or defined a BCP. We have the tools and we've got stuff replicated, but we've not actually documented what happens and what's needed, and basically who all the stakeholders are. So at a minimum, your BCP should include knowledge of all potential threats that could cause downtime to your business. For example, if your business was located by a lake or a river or by the sea, maybe you're more prone than other businesses to flooding. If it's close to maybe some forest land, and you're in a state in the US, or you're in a country over here in Europe where it's prone to very hot summers, maybe your business is then possibly liable to catch fire. So you need to have a full understanding of all those potential threats specific to your business, and not necessarily to just businesses in general. You need to have detailed documentation for all your production workloads and their dependencies. That's super important. There's no point in having documentation for everything that you know about, but maybe somebody who used to work in the company, or somebody who works in a different branch of the company or the organization, they know about that. And if anything happens, sure, we can just give them a call. That's not probably an ideal scenario. Everything should be documented, so you don't have one person, single point of failure in terms of a knowledge gap. Contact information for all application owners and support vendors. Both are very important. So in the event that you need to recover or restore workloads, you may need to contact a third-party support vendor. They might have license keys. They might have software that you need. There could be any kind of reason you need to contact them. Maybe there's bespoke code and development that needs to be run, or maybe different processes that a specific application needs to invoke if it has to be restored, or if it has to start up in a different location. So in the event of a disaster, you need to certainly know who to contact, and it's not always just folks within your org. Detailed documentation of firewall access and NAT rules. So NAT is network address translation, for anyone who's not familiar with that term. And basically, we've had scenarios before where customers have reached out to us and said, hey, we've had a disaster, or we've got some downtime, and we want to bring up our secondary site, and we've brought up all the servers, and we've brought up all the applications, but they don't work. We can't access them. And often it's down to, because maybe the firewall that was in the original location, maybe it's on-prem or the primary location, that firewall was configured with certain rules that allow certain users from different countries or different states or different scenarios access that software. And if you don't have detailed documentation of those rules and those access permissions, then you can't possibly guess how to configure a second firewall in your second site. So obviously you would want like for like, but just in case, make sure it's very well documented. Remote access to external DNS record providers. Again, another one. So if you have applications that your users and your customers maybe access across the public internet and require maybe a www address or whatever the external URL is, if that workload is hosted in your primary data center and that primary data center then needs to be flipped over to your secondary data center, you need to ensure at a minimum, where possible, that you have access to the external DNS record providers. So you can do things like reduce the time to live of a DNS-A record or an MX record or whatever the record is that you need, a PTO record to reference the new location. Obviously, a lot of this should be done in advance, and I'll show you some architectures later where we can kind of consider this. But if you've got a scenario where you don't have those DNS record providers documented, or you do have them documented, but maybe they're not 24/7, maybe they don't work on a Sunday, if it's an external support provider, you might be in a bit of trouble. So that certainly needs to be considered as well. Regularly validated and documented offsite backups. This should be a no-brainer. Most organizations have regular backups, but the validation piece is really important. Just because your backup application tells you it's backing up software or it's backing up your files, your folders, your virtual machines, please, 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 if you're not doing it already, please perform random backup tests. So random as in pick random files and folders, define that as part of your business continuity plan, because there's no worse scenario than having an outage, figuring out that you need to return to your backup plan, and all of a sudden realizing that your backups are corrupted, or maybe they haven't worked, and maybe there's been a bug with the application that backs them up, whatever. So be very careful with that. Just because you have a backup, make sure it's validated. And then emergency remote access information. So put in place, if we have to revert to our remote access, or sorry, our secondary data center or a secondary location, how's our users going to access? Are we going to have them work from home and come in with something like Azure Virtual Desktop or Citrix or a traditional VPN client? They all need to be considered. Or are we going to put them into like a hot seat scenario? So are we going to rent office space somewhere and have customers come in and users come in and basically use that site, which has pre-configured firewalls up to the secondary data center? These are all considerations that you need to take into account. And then finally, you need to, and this is really important, you need to define and fully agree across the business the recovery point objective and recovery time objectives. And if you're asking yourself, what are recovery point objectives and what are recovery time objectives? Hopefully I can explain them a little bit more on this slide. So your recovery point objective basically defines the maximum tolerated point in time that data can be recovered from. So basically, if you have your data being backed up and the furthest your backup goes is 30 days, and after 30 days, it overwrites itself. And if you don't take maybe a backup set out of circulation and keep it and do that father-grandfather scenario, well, then your recovery point objective can be no more than 30 days. If you have a backup plan where your data can go back 90 days or a year or 2 years or whatever, that is your recovery point objective. And it's very important to understand that from a business perspective, because if your organization gets hit with ransomware or data corruption in any way, that data corruption and or ransomware payload may well have infected your backups up to a certain point in time. And if you only have a short recovery point objective for your backups, well, then it's very possible that your backups are corrupt and you will not be able to recover. So basically, using an RPO to recover from an outage is essentially defining a measured amount of data that you're willing to lose during the time interval. So that's really important to understand. Next up, we have the recovery time objective. So the recovery time objective, or RTO, this defines the amount of time it will take to return your environment to a fully working state. So I've been in scenarios before where we've been asked to come in and help customers recover after some sort of disaster. Maybe it's a fire or whatever. and they might come to us and say, hey, here's my backup. I remember a good few years ago when back at a time when people were still using backup tapes, LTO tapes. And a customer handed me an LTO tape and said, I have this from this backup from 2 days ago. We need to get back up and running quickly. So with that backup tape, I said, I'm delighted if this is a working backup, your recovery point objective, i.e. the amount of data that you go back to is only 2 days. That's brilliant. But if you don't have a secondary site and infrastructure ready, it could take at least a week, if not longer, for us to rebuild operating systems, restore system state, restore applications, bring in vendors. Yes, your data is safe, but then your recovery time objective becomes important, because until you recover that environment, the clock is ticking on how long it takes to recover it. And then each day costs money because you're not working. So your recovery time objective, again, if you've already identified it and you've already agreed it, brilliant. But if you've not agreed and identified it, you need to sit down with all stakeholders in your organization and be realistic when agreeing them. So what I mean by that is often you'll have a CEO or CFO. If you ask them what's your recovery time objective, they might turn around and say 1 hour or half a day or even 1 day. Can you meet those RTOs? Possibly, but it's going to take a big budget, because you're going to need to have everything live in that secondary site, ready to rock, everything replicated, everything automated. There's a lot of effort and a lot of financial consideration has to go into it. Whether it's Azure, AWS, Google, or your own secondary data center, same scenario. And sometimes when you do the math and you show those those stakeholders like your CEO and CFO the cost of having a recovery time objective of half a day or a full day, they may pretty quickly tell you, no, maybe we have to be more realistic, maybe 2 days or 3 days. It doesn't really matter once the business are agreed to it and once everyone locks it into the business continuity plan. That's the important piece, because it will take a significant amount of time if you try and recover just from a backup. Your data will be safe, but it will take time. So those 2 points, RPO and RTO, really important, regardless of whatever the tooling is that you use for the BCDR scenarios in your environment. Okay, so let's talk about some standard BCDR strategies. So we've got 3 of them from an Azure perspective. Again, if you're not Azure focused, these would be applicable to other vendors as well. So in scenario 1, I'm going to talk to you about how to protect workloads that are already in Azure or in the public cloud. Then we're going to talk about how to protect workloads to Azure or to the public cloud. And then finally, we'll just talk a little bit about SaaS or software as a service workloads, how to protect them to Azure, because software as a service is basically a service that is managed by a vendor that is not yourselves. So typically you don't have to worry about hardware, about managing, and often about backups. But there may well be some scenarios where the software as a service solution does not have a traditional backup that aligns with your RPO or your RTO. And if that's the case, then you need to think about a different scenario, which is scenario 3 here. Okay, so first up, scenario 1, protect in Azure. So with scenario 1, what we recommend is have a look at Azure Backup. So a lot of folks would look at traditional external vendor or third-party vendor backup tools, which is totally cool. But if you're considering changing your backup, or if even you've not really got a solid backup tool that you want to use, or you just want to get a little bit more cloud native because you're already up in the cloud and you just don't want the hassle of having to manage traditional tapes or traditional storage area networks or NAS devices or whatever, Azure Backup is now and has now become a modern enterprise class backup solution. It's nice and easy to configure because it's straight out of the box in the cloud. It's secure, so Microsoft will stand over its infrastructure. It will bring all kinds of ransomware protection and security behind it. You can lock it down with role-based access control that's already in place in your Microsoft 365 in your Entra tenant. It's cost effective because you're not buying hardware, you're not buying media. It's already in the cloud. It's an OpEx as opposed to a CapEx. You can manage it at scale, so there's no limit as to how much data you can back up. You can just keep expanding it. And it does have a diverse workload support, so it doesn't just back up workloads in Azure or workloads from Microsoft. It will back up multiple workload types depending on what you need. Is it the be all and end all? As in, does it back up all types of workloads? No. So I mentioned earlier the third party ecosystem. So with Azure Backup, you can natively back up things like Azure workloads, like virtual machines, on-premises servers, not just Windows. They can be Windows, they can be Linux. It doesn't matter. Azure PostgreSQL, HANA, blob storage, disks, and files. You can do all of the traditional Azure workloads you can back up using Azure Backup. You can also connect any of these third-party products like Commvault and Veeam and Dell and Druva to do the same thing. So you don't have to have one over the other. But the advantage maybe of some of those third-party ecosystem tools is that they may well do scenarios that Azure Backup does not. For example, if you wanted to back up SAP or AIX or some sort of legacy system that a traditional third-party backup provider, or if you like, a backup provider with a lot longer history than Azure Backup has, well then that's totally cool. You can use that. You can connect it to Azure. All of these vendors have virtual solutions that you can plug into Azure, and you can just run from there as well. So you could even move your Commvaults and your VMs and your Druvas and stuff up into Azure and reduce your requirement for storage on-prem as well. So there's certainly advantages to it, and definitely an enterprise-grade tool. So the next scenario is Protect to Azure. So from Protect to Azure, the cost of Azure is based on consumption. So I mentioned CapEx versus OpEx. You are only going to use what you have deployed and what you are running. At any point, you can delete it. So you're not buying a bunch of hardware and leaving it in a data center for 5 years or 3 years, whatever license model or SKU model you purchase. You can spin it up and spin it down, and you can move it around to different regions. It's very, very flexible. With Azure, as I mentioned earlier, you've got all your third-party options, you've got your different regions, and you can deliver it all without any impact to production workloads. You've also got built-in resiliency. You're not going to get much more secure than Microsoft's own public cloud platform. So there's never going to be an issue where the backup product falls over, because Microsoft have mitigated for that across their global their global platform. And then there is a broad ISV ecosystem. So again, not even the vendors that I showed on the previous slide. There are many, many different vendors out there who will plug into to Azure from a Protect perspective and allow you to configure those kind of secure and highly resilient backups and failover locations into the cloud. So not just backing up, but you can replicate workloads and data up to Azure as well. So one of those tools that can replicate, and again, it's an Azure Cloud Native tool, is called Azure Site Recovery. And Azure Site Recovery basically clones your live server. So we mentioned active and passive scenarios. So with Azure Site Recovery, or ASR, you can run your production workloads on premises, and you can then just configure Azure Site Recovery to replicate those workloads from your on-prem VMware or Hyper-V environment, or if it's just a bunch of physical servers and you don't have either of those hypervisors, you can just replicate them up into an Azure landing zone and have it ready to go for if and when, hopefully not, but if and when you do have an outage. It will help reduce infrastructure costs, we mentioned earlier, because you don't have to purchase that expensive storage, and you don't have to pay that other vendor, for additional data centers like secondary data centers and hot seats and stuff like that. And then your downtime is minimized because it's a replicated environment. You can consistently test it offline. You can validate it offline. It's fully compliant with your auditor's requirements. If you've got any auditors who come in and say, show us your BCDR policy and what you're backing up and what your RPOs and your RTOs are, it's very, very flexible. And then it is very heterogeneous as well. So just because it's a Microsoft product doesn't mean that it's only going to replicate or back up Microsoft workloads. If your workloads are non-Microsoft, if they're sitting on VMware, if they're sitting on Hyper-V, then there's not a problem. You can back them up to Azure, or replicate them to Azure without an issue. We mentioned the partners earlier. So earlier was about backups, but also this is about the replication. So you can certainly replicate using some of those third-party vendors. up into Azure. So you would still use an Azure Recovery Services Vault and or an Azure Storage account, but you would then have a virtual appliance from any of those partners or plus more who will also provide the similar scenario. So I'm not trying to just do the Azure pitch here. If you've got tools, you've already invested in licenses for any of the well-known enterprise BCDR organizations, their solutions will plug into Azure and or AWS and possibly G Suite. I would assume G Suite, but Azure and AWS are probably the two most common that all of the vendors support. And then the final scenario, scenario 3. So this is SaaS to Azure. And the reason I wanted to show this slide in our BCDR is that most organizations that we talk to now, whether they're using Azure or whether they're using AWS or another partner, most of them are using Microsoft 365 for their collaboration. So they're using Teams or Exchange Online, SharePoint, OneDrive, all of these tools. And with Azure, you can extend your backups for a SaaS product like Microsoft 365 into Azure. Now, let me be clear. At the moment, as in before I show you something that's in preview, if you wanted to specifically use Microsoft native backup tools to back up Microsoft 365, up until probably 6 months ago when a new product became available in preview, there was no way of doing it. Microsoft would say, well, all your emails are already configured with deleted items retention, and you can extend that to a certain number of days. All of your files are configured with immutability up until 94 days, and that should be all you need. So vendors like Commvault and Veeam and Keep It Safe, they've really come into their own in terms of providing third-party solutions that give that granular brick level backup and recovery for Microsoft 365. And Microsoft were getting a lot of flack about this. And as a result, Microsoft have brought out a new preview, which is the new cloud native Microsoft 365 backup tool. So the reason I wanted to show this tool is it's due to be, it's in preview for anyone to use at the moment. And it is due to be released to general availability within probably, hopefully, the next couple of months. And this would be a really cool cloud native tool that you can leverage from Azure to get that Microsoft 365 backup scenario. Now, there are certainly scenarios where you might not want to have your Microsoft vendor. If you're in Azure, you might not want Microsoft to be also the backup vendor. That's totally understandable. That's where the third-party solutions come in. Likewise, you might have something like Salesforce, and Salesforce obviously have their own cloud and their own platform and their own backup solution, but you might want to extend that backup solution out of Salesforce and back up, for example, your Salesforce data into Azure. So you don't have, if you like, all of your eggs in the one basket. So either scenario, whatever your SaaS product is, certainly check and see, is there a way that that SaaS provider can deliver a backup workload into Microsoft Azure, whether it be a storage account or a site recovery backup vault, either or. But if it's Microsoft 365 and if you're trying to figure out how are we backing this up, or we're not happy with the RPO that it gives and the recovery point objective that it gives, well, then certainly check out the new M365 backup here. By the way, these slides will be shared with everyone on the call. So if you're trying to take screenshots, or if you're trying to click on the links and they don't work, or whatever, you're just trying to take notes, don't worry about it. We'll make sure that everyone gets a copy of the slides as well, with all of the different links and the different notes. Okay, so let's dig into ransomware and cyber recovery. So ransomware, cyber recovery, this is where BCDR really comes into its own. This is real world, in the news day in, day out these days. Here's some stats that we took from some updated manuals and white papers that some of the big security vendors have released recently. So in 2023, every 11 seconds, a company across the world was hit by ransomware. Average cost of 2.73 million to recover from ransomware attacks. Obviously, that's an average cost, not for everyone. Some orgs are smaller. And sometimes it depends on the cost of Bitcoin, because that's normally what the ransom is that they require. There's $1.1 billion on average of reported ransom paid. So it is a super lucrative business for these threat actors to create ransomware and to distribute it out across the globe, and specifically target large organizations in different sectors. These are some interesting facts here. Of all the victims, 46% of them paid a ransom demand. I can't blame them if your backups are all corrupted, if your environment, if it gives you only one option, and that's to maybe take a chance and pay or lose everything. You can see why people might pay. But only 61% of their data, on average, of course, they retrieved. So either the rest of the data was just not retrievable, or wasn't even shared back, or just couldn't be decrypted with the keys. And only 57% of the victims who actually paid a ransom demand actually recovered all of their data successfully. There's some damaging numbers. Another statistic I thought was quite interesting is that 93% of ransomware is Windows-based executables. So basically, in some way, shape, or form, when the threat actors get into your environment, they normally execute a payload via Windows in some way. So the Microsoft ecosystem, because it's the most common operating system for clients and for servers across the world. So that's something to be aware of. It's probably not surprising, but it's a key fact that a lot of organizations are not aware of. And we did this last year. We did this very similar survey, webinar last year. And last year, the sector that was most targeted was the education sector. This year, or when I say this year, with the latest version of this report, it's the government sectors that are most hit by it, which is shows the threat actors are moving into different areas of target range. So some of the root causes of ransomware attacks: exploited vulnerabilities. Like, that's a no-brainer. I'm going to talk to you in a little while about how you can potentially make sure that your legacy operating systems and database systems are protected for those bugs and those backdoors and stuff that maybe the likes of Microsoft might have left open. Compromised credentials. So that's a very common method. People will figure out usernames and passwords in some way, shape, or form. Malicious emails, 18% there. That's no surprise, really. Actually, it's good to see that number come down. It hasn't changed in the last couple of years, but I would say maybe 5-6 years ago, that was probably up around 50-60%, that target. But people are much more aware and much more conscious now of phishing and malicious emails coming in. Phishing, I mentioned, 13%. Brute force attack, very old school method of trying to break into external IT environments, 3% there, and then 1% on download. Predominantly, that number is so small because, I would imagine anyway, because malware detection software is getting so good, and web browsers have all this built-in download scanners that it's a lot more difficult for people to get hit. But again, some interesting stats there. And then finally on this slide, recovery time. So each of these columns represent one of the last 3 years. So the dark blue, or the navy column, is the most up to date. So it's 2023. And then the very light blue on the far left is from 2021. So it's 21, 22, and 23. Interesting that this year, 28% of organizations took up to a week to recover their environment after getting hit with ransomware. That number is down on the last 2 years. So ransomware is getting more complex, more nasty, more creepy, I guess, and it's coming in and it's just investing itself across the network and across the environment, and it's causing more trouble, and it's less likely then for an organization to recover from the ransomware attack in less than a week. Up to 1 month, we can see 30%. That's increased, which is a good number. 1 to 3 months, 27%. Have increased there, but 3 to 6 months, 8% still is a big number. And if it took your business that long, maybe if it took your business even 1 month, I guess that's probably not sustainable for most organizations. So some interesting stats there. How to protect your organization from ransomware. Hopefully everybody has ransomware planning, or has at least ransomware training in place. But just for reference, the key recommendations for protecting your org from ransomware are to create a response plan. So this is slightly different to the business continuity plan, but it should tie into it. And make sure that you adopt the right tools. By the way, the right tools don't have to be Microsoft tools if you're using Azure, or Amazon tools if you're using AWS. Just make sure you've got the right tools for your organization and that they tick the box for everything that you need. And whatever the tooling platform is, that's what you lead with, and that's what you're comfortable with. But make sure you do have tooling in place that will help you respond if you get hit with ransomware, and that you can basically implement that data recovery backup process in a pretty fast time. An obvious one in the middle pillar, prevent attackers from getting in. If we all had our way, attackers would never get in, but it's nobody can guarantee they'll never get hacked, right? So just make sure that you concentrate on things like hardening your security perimeter, again, by leveraging best-in-class security workloads and tooling. Put in place comprehensive prevention, detection, and response capabilities. Make sure you have SIEM and extended detection, cross-workload security. So again, don't just rely on, say, Microsoft, or don't just rely on open source tools. Have a combination of them. And if sometimes those tools, particularly for critical workloads or public-facing workloads, if those tools sometimes repeat the same alerting, there's a good balance to be had in terms of maybe that's not a bad thing, because if they're different workloads and different vendors, at least you've got the box ticked and you're seeing it across multiple vendors. And then protect your critical data from compromise. Look, I know a lot of these points are very obvious. That's what everybody wants to do anyway. But it is important to consider, maybe you look at and you focus critical data differently, how you manage and how you secure critical data differently than you would non-critical data like dev and test. So just make sure that you've got your business continuity plan in place. You've got granular segmentation. So you've separated backups and air gapped your backups. So if you do get hit, or if your backups do get corrupted, you've got that external backup that's not been hit because it's completely separated from the environment. Okay, I'm not going to read through every single line. Again, these slides will be shared with everyone, but a typical cyber recovery process for ransomware basically involves detection. So you have to have tooling in place to be able to detect the ransomware and detect the threat actor. If you don't have it in place, well, then you'll only find out when you maybe come in on a Monday morning and find that all of your systems have been encrypted. So make sure you invest in the right tooling and you get the right messaging in at a quick pace. If you do find, or if your tooling does detect something, make sure that you can triage that issue very quickly. There's a whole bunch of steps that you can walk through. Probably the most important is executing your incident response plan, and maybe engaging with a cyber insurance company as well. So if you don't have cyber insurance with an insurance organization, please do consider it, because if you get hit, if your organization gets hit, most likely, depending on your business, you may have to go public with it. That will affect your stocks, or that will affect your customer base, and your cyber insurance company will have gone through this multiple times with other customers and should be able to advise and guide you on the best way to deal with it. Analyze. So when you find out where it is, analyze how much damage basically the ransomware has hit with. Contain it. So if it's hit some production systems, or if it's hit a data center in one region, but maybe not data centers in other regions, make sure that you figure out how to contain it, and then recover. So then once you've contained it, once you know what it is and you've analyzed it, you've contained it, make sure that you have all of your systems ready to rock, that you can recover, whether that's a secondary site in the cloud or a secondary data center with secondary firewalls and all of the relevant stuff that you need. Make sure it's ready so you can move quickly and you can recover and you can hit that RTO that's been agreed with all the stakeholders in your BCP. So that's a typical one. But you look at the average amount of time. You saw from the previous slide, the average amount of time is weeks to months, and that's often not palatable for organizations. So with the right tooling, I mentioned air gaps. If you've got like immutable offsite backup, so if you're using, say, Azure Backup and most of those other vendors I spoke about earlier, they will all have options in their backups where you can stop your backup sets from being modified in any way. So if you've got a backup from a week ago and it's immutable, if the threat actor comes into the environment and tries to interrogate or infect that backup set, it won't be able to do it. So straight up, that that's at least covering you from that point in time. Air gapping it is, keeping it separate. So if ransomware comes in and spreads really quickly, like wildfire through your estate, if it's completely air gapped, so maybe not connected, your backups are not connected directly to the environment, well, then you won't have your backups affected as well. And do have that tertiary site ready to rock. So if you have a secondary site, all of the stuff, all of the components that are needed are ready to go. Again, this is down to your recovery time objective, and you can pull the trigger, and you could potentially be back up and running in hours if you integrate those additional processes into your typical best practice around cyber recovery. So often we have customers, especially when we did the first one of these webinars a couple of years back, I didn't have this next section, and questions from a number of attendees was, that's all great, but how does Ergo do it? Is Ergo doing this, or what exactly does Ergo do to implement BCDR? So I said, okay, let's have a talk to. I had a talk to our security and operations teams. I said, give me the high level what we do, and let me share this with all of our attendees. So we've got 5 steps. We'll talk about frameworks, policies, strategies in the first step, staff training, awareness, third-party management, protection, detection, and response, testing, validation, and improvements, and then reporting, sharing, and optimizing. And I'm going to fly through these each of these different areas, just so you understand what we talk about when we talk about frameworks and policies and strategies. So I cannot reiterate again, senior management and all stakeholders must understand IT risk. It shouldn't just be the IT team who are responsible for cybersecurity strategies. They should lead it, but they need to have the senior management involved. Otherwise, it's just going to have folks, when are we back up? When are we back up? How long are we down? How long is this going to take? It's just not going to work. And that's just adding more stress to the IT team. So you must involve all stakeholders. Essentially, senior management must have sign off. They obviously don't have to be technically involved deep in the weeds, but they need to understand, as part of that business continuity plan, this is the framework, these are the RPOs, these are the RTOs, this is the budget you've given us, so this is how we map to it, and everyone's good. Make sure that they can relate the risk to business impact. So if they tell you, hey, we don't have a budget for that, you're not getting a budget of, I don't know, 50,000 or 100,000, you're not getting for BCDR, that's fine. Here's what the risk is then if you don't pay that. And everyone has to sign off on that. And do monitor third-party providers. That's really important. I'm sure most people will have heard of SolarWinds a couple of years back, who are a very well-known monitoring organization. Threat actors got into SolarWinds' own environment, and they were in that environment for months, and they basically infected the agents that SolarWinds used to deploy out to as monitoring tools to their customers to monitor network devices and servers. So essentially, by a customer in good faith deploying SolarWinds agents at the time to their servers to monitor, unwittingly they were also deploying a payload that a threat actor had put into SolarWinds. That's dangerous. It's really hard to obviously mitigate against that. That's up to the third-party provider. But it's certainly important to capture that information. Create a plan that fully defines your policies. We talked about that already. Again, govern those third-party providers, establish the risk tolerance and the impact of your IT disruptions. When you have a look at your resilience strategy, the business management must be synonymous. Set the clear information and the key risk metrics, and then embed cyber strategy into every element of the business. Provide cyber training at all levels. All staff should be getting training. We're seeing a very, very good uptake from most of our customers and organizations these days around cyber training, which is brilliant. But make sure that people understand what MFA is, how important it is. From an administration perspective, things like privilege identity management, phishing, do those training courses and make sure that people on board to them and make sure people sign up to them. Cyber awareness, pretty much the same. Get all the relevant different business units involved, make sure they all understand the potential risks, and then create a third-party IT risk management program. So again, just make sure that you've got the escalation processes and you've got all of the relevant proof of backups from those third parties in place as well. Don't just take their word for it. Then from a protection mechanism perspective, things like firewalls, we mentioned that earlier, encryption, Dark web monitoring is a really good one. So most good security operation centers and malware providers and detection organizations will monitor the dark web. So just in case you unwittingly get hit with some cyberware or some ransomware, you might not even know. And on the dark web, somebody could be pitching your business. So make sure that you've got some sort of concept or some sort of visibility into an organization that is doing some dark web monitoring on your behalf. It doesn't have to be super expensive, but it is an important one. Also, build with code. If you are using DevOps processes at the moment, please keep doing so and make sure that you validate your code and that you're running linting to ensure that you don't put any company secrets or passwords or keys or whatever out there. But when you build your environments with code, it ensures that you have that environment ready to deploy exactly as you expect it every time. So you've got that consistency in your deployment. When we talk about detection protocols, you're going to monitor your network performance, and you're going to look at IT-related incidents. So have a look at all IT-related incidents, try and identify, are there any single points of failure? And when you've done that, then make sure that your incident management process is established and is implemented, and do it on a regular basis. Because when you do that, you'll be able to detect those incidents much easier. You'll be able to manage them much easier, and you very well be able to notify all relevant stakeholders very quickly if you get hit with an issue. And then the test, validate, and improve. So we mentioned air-gap backups, documented recovery procedures, risk-based approach. If we look at testing continuous improvements, you must employ threat-led penetration testing in the middle column here, folks, at least every 3 years. So that should be a scenario where you have external providers, external partners, external security experts coming in and penetration testing your environment. It's sign off, work with them. These organizations are really, really good. They're nothing to do with your current support provider. You don't want your current support provider checking their own homework, basically. But these organizations who run these pen tests or threat-led pen testing, they can uncover some really, really good gaps that you may not be aware of, because they will put on the hat of a hacker or of a threat actor, and they will try the same methodologies and the same tools. So do make sure, if you're not considering that it's something that you put into your business continuity plan and you put into your cyber attack and ransomware planning as well. And then just ensure you continuously validate. I mentioned earlier about backups and replication. Do test and do backup those, do test those backups, do validate them. Just because the tool and the platform is telling you that you have a backup and it's all good, make sure that it does actually work. Do some random tests, random recoveries, and validate that the data is there and that they work. And then the final slide just in this section is just the reporting, the sharing, the optimizing. Just to summarize this, basically when you've been hit with an issue, and this is where, if you onboard with a cyber insurance organization, they can advise you if it's a big outage, but make sure that you do the right reporting to the right people. That could be to external news outlets, or it could, and the public, or it could be to just your internal C-level leadership team and your staff. Make sure that you report well on it. Make sure that you share the information clearly and truthfully as well, where possible. Obviously, you don't want to compromise your organization or any company secrets in terms of any IP that you have, but sharing that information in some cases is regulatory, and in other scenarios, it's just a good thing to do from a trust perspective. And then continuously optimize. Just keep making sure that you're bettering your processes and that you're driving forward with new innovations and new ways to manage that environment. Okay, so the final section then we have is just how to strengthen your security posture with Azure. So basically, we mentioned earlier about some legacy workloads. So Windows Server 2012 is considered now a legacy workload. We are 12 years outside of the original release date of Windows Server 2012 and SQL Server 2012. And since October last year and July 2022, both of those workloads are out of support, which means that if there is a bug or if there is a vulnerability, Microsoft do not leave or do not release any new security fixes for them. Whereas if you move those workloads to Azure, and this is exclusive to Azure, if you move those workloads to Azure, Microsoft will give you free extended security updates for them. So you can mitigate very quickly if you still have Windows Server 2012 in your environment, you can manage and you can have those security updates for free from Microsoft for the next probably 2-3 years, depending on the version of Windows Server 2012. In another year, in another year and a half, Windows Server 2016 will go the same way, because that will be out of support, and then Microsoft will offer the same as well. So do consider that if you've got Windows Server 2012. I mentioned a couple of times earlier about landing zone. So if you've bought into, we want or we need a BCDR solution, or we've already got one, then you need to make sure that the backend environment or platform that those workloads are hosted in this case Azure, but again it could be AWS. You need to make sure that that environment is secure and it's well managed, and you've got visibility of costs. And landing zones can be quite complicated. And our recommendation from a Microsoft perspective is to review and align with Microsoft's cloud adoption framework. And I've got a link to it here. It's all about the business strategy, the people strategy, and the technology strategy. This is not specific to BCDR, but it is specific to the overall platform and the overall framework where you host your BCDR environment. And it's really, really important that if you don't feel that you have a best practices as your landing zone, or if you're not sure if you have one, well, then what we could do is we could work with you, or you could do it yourself. And you can leverage this tool. It's a free tool that Microsoft have called simply the Azure Landing Zone Review Tool. This will help you to assess your landing zone readiness. You can use it to identify areas for investment, improve your overall results, and just basically give you a walkthrough and a score as to whether or not your environment is up to scratch and aligns with best practices. I've got a link in this slide here where you can launch into it. This tool is part of Microsoft's cloud adoption framework as well. So there's many, many tools in there. If you do link your environment to Azure, if you've got workloads in Azure, or even if they're on-prem and you don't want to move them to Azure, you can leverage all the security services up there that are part of their cloud-native application protection platform. So you leverage tools like Purview, Defender, Azure Network Security, Sentinel. Basically bring all of those security services into play, and you can target them at your on-prem workloads. You can target them at your other cloud provider workloads, and obviously you can also target them at your Azure workloads as well. And when you configure that any of those components in Defender for Cloud, you can then have that full visibility and that full 360 view of your DevOps, your security posture management, and your cloud and or other provider workloads all in one place. So, folks, that was a very long and a lot of information in a short space of time. I'm happy to stay around as long as people need for Q&A at the end of this. The call to action on this would be to, if you're interested in any of this and you're interested in working with Ergo on any of this, please schedule a BCDR use case discovery session with your Ergo account team. We can work with you to schedule a roadmap planning or value realization session that's specific to your environment and your licensing investments as well. So please do reach out to the account team, and we're more than happy to help. And I can jump on a call with any of you folks that have any questions, and more than happy to expand this further. So any questions? I'll just have a look at the Q&A. Nothing in the Q&A. I don't see any other questions. I've either explained it super well or everybody's fallen asleep. It's one or the other. Ryan, are you happy enough? Is there anything that you want to add?
Nope, nothing to add. I appreciate it. I hope everyone found this insightful, and maybe take away and talk with your teams about potential opportunities to whether it's looking specifically at improving your business continuity and disaster recovery plan or strategy, or if you're just interested in kind of understanding what you have in your EA and how you could, take advantage of what you have in your licensing. We're happy to do that as well. So appreciate it, Kevin.
Cool. Okay. Yes, there's no more questions coming in, so I think I'll wrap it up at that. And thanks to everyone for hanging around, and have a great day. Cheers.